There is a moment, they say, when every great institution looks in the mirror and decides what it truly is. For the British monarchy, that moment arrived quietly, not with a trumpet fanfare or a proclamation read from gilded steps, but in a series of private conversations, careful decisions made behind closed palace doors, and a plan so deliberate that those watching from the outside could only see the results, never the machinery behind them. And at the center of it all stood one woman. Not born into royalty, not groomed from birth for a throne, a woman who had faced illness, public scrutiny, personal loss, and still walked back into the light with her head up and her shoulders square. Her name was Catherine. And King Charles III had decided, in the final chapter of his own reign, that she would be the face of everything that came next. For most of British history, the monarchy operated on a single unspoken rule. The king or queen reigned, and everyone else waited their turn. Succession was linear, orderly, and largely undisturbed by personal preference. But King Charles III, from the very first months of his reign, showed that he intended to do things differently. He had waited over 7 decades to wear the crown, and he was not going to spend whatever time he had left simply managing the status quo. He was going to reshape the institution from within, and he was going to make sure the right people were ready to carry it forward when he no longer could. The signs began appearing early in 2026, and to those paying close attention, they told a coherent story. Palace officials confirmed that King Charles was reducing his cancer treatment schedule, and while the language used was careful and measured, the underlying message was impossible to miss. His cancer had not gone into remission. He was, by several accounts, operating with a body that had been fighting an invisible war for over 2 years. Privately, insiders described his health as precarious. Publicly, he continued to attend engagements, sign documents, receive dignitaries, and present the image of a monarch very much in command. But behind that image, decisions were being made about what the monarchy would look like after him, and those decisions were centered, more than anything else, on Catherine, the Princess of Wales. To understand why Catherine became so central to Charles's final plan, it is necessary to go back a little further, to a period that tested her in ways that few public figures ever face. In early 2025, Catherine announced that she had reached remission from cancer. The disclosure was followed by a wave of public relief so genuine and so overwhelming that it surprised even seasoned royal observers. For a woman who had spent years navigating the difficult terrain between public duty and private life, the response revealed something important. The British public had developed a deep, almost personal connection to her. She was not simply the Princess of Wales to them. She was someone they had worried about, someone they had prayed for, someone who, by returning to her duties, had demonstrated a kind of quiet courage that people recognized and admired without fully being able to explain it. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams captured the sentiment with clarity when he observed that Catherine had become genuinely key to the monarchy's survival. Her popularity was not manufactured. It was not the product of carefully orchestrated press releases or strategic photo shoots, though those existed too. It was built on something harder to engineer: authenticity. People believed in her, and in a world where public trust in institutions was fragile and easily broken, that belief was invaluable. Charles understood this better than anyone. He had spent much of his adult life watching his own public image fluctuate, shaped and reshaped by events he could not always control. He knew what genuine public affection looked like, and he knew how rare it was, and in Catherine he saw it in abundance. The plan that began to take shape in the months that followed was not announced in a single speech or revealed in a single document. It emerged gradually through a series of formal and informal moves that, taken together, added up to something significant. The most concrete of these was the decision to grant William and Catherine the authority to become grantors of royal warrants, with the role set to take effect in spring 2026. On the surface, this might have appeared to be a procedural matter, a title, a function, a piece of institutional machinery. In reality, it was far more than that. The power to grant royal warrants had traditionally rested with the sovereign alone. By extending it to the Prince and Princess of Wales, Charles was doing something that had rarely been done before. He was formally distributing royal authority downward, giving the next generation a taste of the real power of the crown while he was still alive to oversee the transition. Charles and Queen Camilla had used the same authority since ascending the throne in 2022, awarding warrants to hundreds of companies, from luxury jewelers to supermarket brands, that had provided goods and services to the royal household. It was an enormous and largely underappreciated institutional power, one that connected the monarchy to British commercial life in ways both symbolic and practical. By passing a version of that power to William and Catherine, Charles was making a clear statement. This couple are not simply the future of the monarchy in theory. They are the future of the monarchy in practice, right now, today. But if the royal warrant's decision was significant, it was Catherine's own trajectory within the plan that truly shocked royal insiders. Sources began reporting that Charles had moved deliberately to fast-track her public profile, elevating her role in a way that went beyond standard succession preparation. The word being used behind closed doors was not simply prominent. It was something closer to central. Catherine, according to those close to palace operations, was being positioned not merely as a future queen consort who would support her husband from a step behind. She was being positioned as a figure of independent institutional weight, someone whose public presence, whose personal following, and whose demonstrated resilience under pressure made her, in Charles's view, one of the monarchy's most important assets. The comparison that kept appearing in royal circles was an uncomfortable one for those who guarded the tradition of the institution carefully. People were beginning to compare Catherine to Queen Elizabeth II, not in terms of constitutional role, but in terms of the quality that had made Elizabeth so enduring, an ability to represent the monarchy as something beyond politics, beyond scandal, beyond the noise of any particular era. An 86-year-old woman named Carla Nyerny, speaking to a journalist, put it plainly when she said that if Catherine were to become queen, she would be the greatest queen on earth, and that she reminded her of Elizabeth II. It was the kind of testimonial that royal communications teams could not have written if they tried. It came from an ordinary person who had met Catherine briefly and walked away with a conviction that was as clear as it was unscripted. Meanwhile, Catherine herself was moving into this expanded role with visible confidence. Her first major solo engagement of 2026 set a tone that was warm, personal, and deeply human. She hosted the England women's rugby team at Windsor Castle following their World Cup victory in September 2025. The event was filmed, and in the footage that emerged, Catherine could be seen talking about rugby with genuine enthusiasm, mentioning that her son Louis played touch rugby and that her daughter Charlotte played at home with the family. It was a small moment, but it illustrated something important about her approach to royal duty. She did not simply attend events, she engaged with them. She brought herself to them, her real self, her family, her interests, in a way that made public appearances feel less like performances and more like conversations. That quality, royal experts agreed, was precisely what Charles wanted to amplify and formalize, and he had reason to move quickly. The question of succession had become impossible to separate from the question of his health, and he was sharp enough to know it. Reports from palace insiders described a monarch who was acutely aware that his reign might not run as long as he had once hoped. He had come to the throne late. He had been given less time than he deserved. But he was also a man who had spent decades studying the institution he now led, and he understood that the best thing he could do in the time remaining was to leave it in the strongest possible hands, and to make sure those hands were already carrying the load before the formal transfer came. This was why the language around Catherine began to shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. She was no longer being described merely as William's partner in preparation for the throne. She was being described as a co-architect of the monarchy's future identity. Royal biographer Katie Nischal, speaking about the couple's path forward, noted that their greatest challenge would be navigating the dual role of hands-on parents and future monarchs, and that Catherine understood this tension better than almost anyone else around her. She had spent years getting that balance wrong, then right, then wrong again under extraordinary pressure. She had come through illness, through the collapse of extended family relationships, through global media scrutiny of her recovery, and she had emerged from all of it with her dignity intact and her sense of purpose, by all accounts, stronger than it had been before. For Charles, this arc told him everything he needed to know. He had watched his own mother navigate decades of institutional pressure with grace, and he understood that the monarchy's survival depended not on formal authority alone, but on something more elusive, the capacity to make people believe in the institution's relevance. Catherine had that capacity. She had it naturally, and she had earned it additionally through her conduct during the hardest period of her life. She had shown the public something rare, vulnerability followed by recovery, fragility followed by strength. And in doing so, she had made herself more human and therefore more powerful as a royal figure, not less. Inside the palace, the shift in thinking had practical consequences. Sources began reporting that Catherine had taken on a quiet but significant role in the logistics of succession planning, not simply attending briefings, but actively shaping the frameworks within which future decisions would be made. One account described her consulting with senior courtiers and expert planners on preparations for the transition that would eventually come. Another described palace officials characterizing her as a stabilizing force, someone whose presence helped anchor institutional confidence during a period of considerable uncertainty about the king's health. These were not the duties of a supporting figure. They were the duties of someone who had been, formally or not, placed at the center of the plan. Royal author Catherine Mayer offered a broader view that framed the shift in historical terms. She noted that while the senior royals had handled their responsibilities with dignity, the time had come to pass the central role to William and Catherine, because they were the future of an institution built on generations of commitment and loyalty. The phrase she used, that William and Catherine now carried the entire weight of the monarchy's public identity, was striking not because it was flattering, but because it was accurate. Wherever the couple appeared in 2025 and 2026, they drew crowds, generated warmth, and reinforced a sense that the monarchy was connected to the present rather than retreating into the past. They were, in the eyes of the public, and increasingly in the formal planning of the institution, the primary story. And within that story, Catherine occupied a position that was unique. William was the heir. That was constitutional, fixed beyond discussion. But Catherine was something else, something that the Constitution had not quite anticipated. She was a figure whose public standing, according to multiple expert assessments, had begun to rival and in some measures exceed that of the heir himself. She was not simply popular. She was, in the assessment of those who tracked public sentiment around the monarchy, the person on whom the institution's emotional resonance most depended. Charles understood this, and his plan reflected it. He was not simply preparing his son to be king. He was preparing his daughter-in-law to be a queen whose weight in the institution would be felt from the moment she stepped into the role. Royal correspondent Jenny Bond, reflecting on the burden that William and Catherine now carried, observed that the prospect of becoming king and queen in the foreseeable future must always be present in their minds, and that it must be daunting. But Bond also noted that the best preparation was the one they were already doing, focusing on the work directly in front of them, showing up, proving themselves through the ordinary accumulation of royal duty. And by that measure, Catherine was proving herself in ways that went well beyond ordinary. She was not simply preparing for a role. She was already inhabiting one, the role of the monarchy's most trusted and beloved public face, and doing it with a composure and a humanity that Charles himself had publicly admired and privately relied upon. By the middle of 2026, the contours of Charles's final monarchy plan were visible enough for those willing to see them. He had stripped away the outdated and the scandalous, formally removing his brother Andrew's royal titles at the end of 2025 and streamlining the institution to its most essential core. He had redistributed power in ways that prepared the next generation for the realities of ruling rather than simply waiting. And he had placed Catherine, the woman from Berkshire who had become, through effort and endurance and an extraordinary personal journey, one of the most admired royal figures in the world, at the heart of everything that came next. Not as a background presence, not as an accessory to the heir, as the face of the monarchy's future. It was, in its own way, the most personal and perhaps the most consequential decision of Charles's reign. He had waited a lifetime for his moment on the throne, and he had spent it preparing for a world beyond himself. The palace shock in the end was not that Charles had a plan. It was the depth and the clarity of it, and the fact that at its center he had chosen not the most obvious figure but the most extraordinary one.